The sting of salt spray lashes your face as you're hauled toward the waiting ship. The ropes bite into your wrists, coarse fibers grinding your skin raw. At 17, you had thought the world was small and knowable, the ragged coastlines of your island, the fields where your mother's hands pulled grain from earth, the warmth of the hearth where you once believed nothing evil could enter. Now that world burns behind you. Smoke rolls up from your village, black pillars rising against a gray sky, the air thick with the choking funeral pyre of everything familiar. The men who drag you speak in clipped, alien sounds, their laughter coarse and sharp. Like a kennel of hounds, you do not understand their words, but you understand their meaning. To them, you are not a daughter, not a sister, not a friend, you are plunder, a prize, a body to be carried away. This is no isolated cruelty, it is the first step on a road many before you have walked, a path worn into the history of Europe by fire, chains, and the creak of longship timbers. This was the Viking Age, an era spanning from the late 8th century into the mid-11th. When Scandinavian seafarers pushed out into the wider world, we imagine them as bold explorers, fierce raiders, master shipbuilders. We picture sagas recited in firelit halls, dragon-proud ships cleaving the sea, and the fabled raid on Lindisfarne in 793, the dawn of their legend. But behind the heroic gloss lies a harsher truth. The Norse did not rise on bravery and adventure alone. Their economy leaned heavily on a trade as chilling as it was systematic, the buying and selling of human beings. Slavery was not an accidental byproduct of raiding. Often, it was the very target. Silver and chalices could be looted, yes, but the most enduring wealth came in the form of living cargo. From the rocky shores of the British Isles to the deep forests of the Slavic East, thousands of women were torn from their homes, stripped of names, and forced into lives of servitude. To the Norse, these captives had a word: thrall, thrall, slave. That single word could erase everything a woman once was. This is not invention or the embellishment of grim imagination. The story comes to us in fragments. Norse law codes that catalogue enslaved people as property alongside oxen and sheep. The terse records of monks who saw their monasteries torn apart. The graves where bones whisper of malnutrition and strain. And the cold-eyed accounts of Arab envoys who dealt directly with Viking merchants. Piece by piece, these sources sketch a world where freedom could be extinguished in a single raid, and where captivity was not exception, but design. Think of it. The raids we picture as storms of chaos were, in truth, deliberate ventures, business more than bloodlust. Chieftains and syndicates of men invested in ships and weapons not only to seize gold, but to fill their holds with human beings. Slave-taking was not incidental cruelty, it was the business model. And for you, dragged from your burning village, that machinery has already claimed you. Ahead lies the open hull of the longship, its carved prow watching like a predator's head. The sea foams against its flanks. Behind, the smoke of your home curls upward until it thins into nothing. In this moment, your old life has already dissolved. Ahead lies the unknown, a journey that will stretch darker than you can yet imagine. When we speak of the Viking Age, the stories tend to glitter. We see them through the lens of sagas written down long after the fact. Heroes draped in furs, ships gliding into new worlds, kings and chieftains boasting in smoky halls of daring raids. Even popular imagination adorns them with horned helmets they never wore, symbols of otherworldly warriors more legend than fact. But behind those stories lay a society less romantic and far more calculating. The Vikings were not only raiders, they were merchants, investors, and opportunists, and the most reliable profit to be found was not in stolen chalices or jeweled reliquaries, but in human lives. For centuries, Norse society wove slavery into its very fabric. A man's power was measured not just in silver or land, but also in the number of thralls under his command. In a culture where reputation was everything, where feasts displayed wealth and generosity, the labor of enslaved people was a silent, essential foundation. Without them, the longhouses would not have stood so well, nor the voyages stretched so far. The evidence comes not from a single story, but from many scattered voices. Monks in Ireland and England wrote bitterly of heathen men who not only pillaged their holy places but dragged away women and children. Norse law codes, fragments preserved in Iceland's Gragas or in Denmark's early statutes, mention thralls with chilling detachment, slotting them into lists of farm property beside cattle, sheep, and tools. Archaeology adds its own testimony. In graves across Scandinavia, bones marked by hard labor and poor diet are found laid alongside wealthier remains. One set of bones tells of a life of burden. teeth ground down from years of turning a quernstone, shoulders scarred by strain. Another, buried with ornaments and weapons, belongs to a freeborn man or woman, even in death. The difference is stark. And then there are the outsiders' accounts. Arab envoys traveling along the rivers of the Rus encountered Norse merchants firsthand. Ahmad ibn Fadlan, in the early 10th century, described the shocking frankness with which these men displayed their captives, how women were treated not as people, but as commodities to be tested and demonstrated before purchase. His words carry the blunt weight of someone who saw what others only heard in rumor. This is why the gleaming image of the Viking as fearless adventurer must always be shadowed by another picture, the machinery of human exploitation that underpinned their society. To admire their shipbuilding skill without acknowledging the cargo those ships carried is to tell only half a story. And yet, it was this duality that made them so dangerous. Their mastery of the sea allowed them to strike anywhere, coasts, islands, even rivers far inland. Their talent for organization meant raids were less chaos and more calculated risk, and their hunger for human labor meant no village, monastery, or settlement was truly safe. As we peel back the myth, the question emerges: how exactly did this system work? What transformed raids from eruptions of violence into the engine of a global slave trade? To answer, we must step inside the structure of Viking expeditions themselves, their financing, their ships, their choice of targets. Only then do we see how deliberate this trade in human beings really was. Popular imagination pictures Viking raids as storms of chaos, sudden bursts of savagery, men leaping from the surf with axes raised, burning and killing without plan. But the truth is colder. Raids were not blind eruptions, they were calculated enterprises, financed and organized with the precision of merchants preparing for market. A raid began long before sails were hoisted. Timber had to be cut for hulls, iron mined and smelted for nails and rivets, wool shorn and spun into the heavy sailcloth that caught the wind. Tar sealed the seams. Barrels of food and ale had to be prepared to sustain the crew. This was not a casual gathering of reckless men, but a costly investment. Chieftains often pooled resources with partners called felagar, bonded by contracts and ambition, men who expected returns on the silver they risked, and the surest return was human cargo. Gold and church plate were alluring, but they could be hidden, melted, or lost. A thrall, once seized, could be worked for years, ransomed for ransom, or sold again and again across the Viking world. A living body was renewable profit, the closest thing the age knew to a guarantee. Their ships were designed for this grim commerce, longships with shallow drafts, slim, flexible, able to cross open seas and slip into rivers far inland. A coastal village might think itself safe, tucked 100 miles from the sea, only to wake and see dark silhouettes gliding silently up the water, escape already cut off. These vessels were not only instruments of war, they were carriers, tuned to deliver their cargo of plundered lives. Targets were carefully chosen. The Vikings had no reason to waste energy on heavily fortified cities when softer prizes lay at hand. Monasteries, for instance, were magnets for attack, rich in treasures, poorly defended, and filled with monks and refugees. They offered both wealth and captives. The famous attack on Lindisfarne in 793 was not merely symbolic, it was efficient. The monks slaughtered, the treasures stolen, and those who survived dragged to the ships. In Ireland, the annals record raid after raid in a kind of brutal litany. One entry from 806 tells how Norse raiders killed 68 monks on the island of Iona. Another, from 821, speaks of Wexford, where a great host of women were carried away. The phrasing is hauntingly repetitive, a signal that this was not occasional cruelty, but the very structure of the Viking economy at work. To modernize, it is difficult to comprehend the mixture of planning and ruthlessness required. Imagine a syndicate of chieftains in Norway or Denmark gathering before a voyage. They discuss not only weapons and supplies but markets. Where will the captives be sold? Dublin. Hedeby. Birka. How many women and children can a ship carry without risking starvation on the voyage? What ransom might be wrung from a monastery that shelters a bishop's niece? Each question is as practical as any merchant might ask about furs or timber. This was the machinery of raids, a seamless blend of violence and commerce. And once the village or monastery was chosen, once the sails were raised, there was little the victims could do but watch the system grind them under. Picture a monastery at dawn, its bell calling sleepy monks to prayer, the stone walls echo with chants, the scent of incense still lingering in the air. Suddenly, the sound changes, shouts, splintering wood, the clash of iron. The raiders are upon them. There is no time to fortify, no militia to rally. Within moments, holy ground becomes a killing field. The Vikings learned early that monasteries were perfect targets. They held treasures, gilded chalices, illuminated manuscripts, reliquaries of saints. But perhaps more importantly, they held people, monks, trained scribes, young novices, villagers seeking shelter behind church walls. For raiders hungry not only for silver but for bodies, these sanctuaries were traps with doors left open. Take the monastery of Iona, a sacred site in the Inner Hebrides. In 806, Norse warriors descended in fury. The annals tell us 68 monks were slaughtered, their blood staining the stones where they once sang hymns. Survivors were not spared. They were dragged in ropes to the shore, destined for ships that would scatter them into lives of servitude. Ireland's records speak with a chilling rhythm. The annals of Ulster note again and again the same phrase: a great host of women carried off. In 821, at Wexford, those words appear with brutal brevity. No names, no details, just the acknowledgement of another community emptied of its daughters. It is the repetition that unsettles most, not a single crime, but a pattern, repeated until it was routine. Even settlements far inland were not safe. The shallow draft ships could skim up rivers, bypassing natural defenses and striking where no one expected them. Imagine a village 100 miles from the sea, lulled into thinking the ocean's violence would never reach so far. One morning, dark silhouettes appear across the water, long ships slicing silently through mist. By the time anyone sounds the alarm, the invaders are already ashore. The devastation was not random. These raids were purposeful, aimed at maximizing human profit. In many cases, wealth in chalices or embroidered vestments was secondary to the value of the people inside. To enslave a literate monk was to capture not only a servant, but someone who might fetch a higher price abroad. To seize women and children was to acquire laborers who could be worked for decades, or concubines who could bear new generations into bondage. The victims, once roped and driven toward the waiting ships, had no illusions. Their homes burned behind them. Their kin lay slain. They were now cargo, destined for markets whose names they had never heard. Dublin, Hedeby, Birka. The longships, poised like hungry wolves, were waiting to consume them. What remains striking is how coldly efficient this system was. The monks who recorded these attacks often wrote in tones of despair, describing the heathen men as scourges of God. But the Vikings themselves were not acting as madmen or mere brutes. They were businessmen of war. Each raid was both terror and transaction. And so the monasteries that once stood as sanctuaries of peace became instead gateways into chains. For countless women and men, the first cry of warning bell was also the toll that marked the end of freedom. The moment of capture was only the beginning. Once the ropes tightened around a woman's wrists, once she was dragged from her home and marched to the waiting ship, her identity began to dissolve. She was no longer daughter, wife, sister, or mother. She became something else entirely. A thrall. The Old Norse word is as sharp as the chains it signified. In the eyes of Norse law, a thrall was not a person but property. Legal codes list them alongside livestock, oxen, sheep, and tools. A farm's wealth was measured not only in fields and cattle, but in the number of enslaved people who worked them. The cold detachment of these records is perhaps more chilling than any tale of raid or slaughter. It reveals a society that saw no contradiction in valuing human beings as little more than animals. For a freeborn woman, life in the Viking world was bounded by a web of protections. Injury to her might be avenged with fines or feuds. Marriage contracts shielded her children's inheritance. But for a thrall, none of this applied. She had no right to testify in court, no protection from violence. A master could strike, abuse, even kill her without penalty. Iceland's Gragas law book declared that the word of a thrall carried no weight. Her voice, legally, was silence. The degradation extended further. A thrall could not marry lawfully. Any union was at the whim of her master. If she bore children, they inherited her chains automatically. Bondage was not a sentence for one life alone. It was a cycle, passed down through generations like a curse. In this way, slavery became self-perpetuating, feeding the Norse economy with unending labor. Language itself reveals the depth of this dehumanization. The word fey in Old Norse meant both cattle and wealth. To be enslaved was to become part of the same category as livestock, a unit of value in an owner's ledger. The poetry of the time offers glimpses too, though rarely sympathetic. The Rigstula, the poem that mythologized the origins of social classes, describes thralls with gnarled hands, hunched backs, and blackened skin from toil. The verses do not mourn them. They place them at the bottom of the social order, destined to labor, as if it were the natural order of things. And yet, behind these laws and verses were living women, stripped of names and stories. Think of one seized from a monastery in Ireland, marched in ropes across muddy roads, shoved onto a ship's deck. Her family may never even learn where she has gone. To those who took her, she is only thrall, a word that erases her past as thoroughly as fire erased her village. The transformation was swift and absolute. Freedom vanished, not with a trial or decree, but in the moment of capture, and from that point forward, a thrall's existence was not her own. She was, in every sense that mattered to Viking society, a possession. Once torn from their homes, the captives' ordeal entered a new stage, the sea voyage. It was here, in the narrow hull of a longship, that terror settled into their bones. The ships themselves were marvels of engineering, sleek, shallow-drafted vessels capable of skimming rivers or braving open seas. But for those crammed within, they were prisons adrift on water. Picture the scene. Dozens of captives, wrists bound, herded into the ship's center like livestock. Around them sat the armed men who had destroyed their villages, their laughter cutting through the crash of waves. The ship was perhaps 70 or 80 feet long, but every plank was filled. Stolen goods lay piled beside them, copper chalices, woolen cloaks, sacks of grain, all jostling as the vessel pitched. The captives huddled in the open air, drenched by frigid spray, with no shelter against the relentless sea. Food and water were scarce. A voyage from Ireland to Scandinavia could last weeks, depending on wind and weather. Captives received only scraps, just enough to keep them alive. Illness spread quickly in such close quarters. Coughs became fevers. Fevers became death. The sick had no graves. Their bodies were cast into the waves, a final anonymity swallowed by the sea. The psychological toll was as heavy as the physical. These were not seasoned sailors, but villagers, monks, women and children who had never ventured beyond familiar coasts. Now the horizon stretched endlessly, the shore a fading memory. Each wave threatened to swamp the low decks. Each storm felt like an omen. Terror gnawed at them as surely as hunger. And yet, for the raiders, this was routine. They had mastered these voyages, tuning their ships to glide where others found only danger. What for captives was nightmare. For Norsemen was business as usual. Every oarstroke carried them closer to profit. Every shivering woman represented a future sail, a coin already half counted in their minds. Some captives may have clung to hope, hope of rescue, hope of escape. But the sea itself was a captor. To leap overboard was to choose drowning in icy waters over bondage, and most did not have the strength. So they endured, day after grinding day, until at last a coastline rose on the horizon. For some, it was the shores of Ireland again, where Norse towns like Dublin waited to turn them into merchandise. For others, it was Denmark, Norway, or Sweden, where markets would scatter them even farther from home. Those who survived the voyage carried its scars for the rest of their lives, the memory of salt spray stinging their eyes, the creak of timbers under their bound bodies, the laughter of their captors echoing over black water. These were the first chapters of a story that would stretch on in chains. Survival of the sea voyage did not bring freedom. It brought the captives into the next chamber of the system, the slave markets. These were not hidden, shameful corners of society, but bustling hubs, woven into the economic life of the Viking world. Dublin, known to the Norse as Dyflin, was one of the most infamous. Founded by Viking settlers in the 9th century, it became more than a stronghold. It was a clearinghouse where human beings were the most valuable commodity. Captives from across Ireland, Wales, and even England were herded into its markets, lined up like livestock, their worth appraised in silver. From there, they might be sold to Norse settlers within Ireland, ferried north to Scandinavia, or dispatched farther still to Iceland and the Faroe Islands. Dublin's wealth and power rested on this trade. By the 10th century, it had grown into one of Europe's busiest ports, a city built on chains. But Dublin was only one node in a far-reaching network. At Hedeby, on the border of modern Germany and Denmark, the air rang with voices from across Europe. Merchants crowded its harbor with goods, furs, amber, iron, and always people. Farther north, Birka in Sweden thrived on the shores of Lake Mälaren, its wooden piers welcoming traders who carried not only coin, but captives seized from raids across the continent. These markets were not isolated. They linked Scandinavia to wider worlds. From Hedeby and Birka, routes stretched eastward along the rivers that cut through today's Russia and Ukraine, leading toward Byzantium and the Abbasid Caliphate. along those routes. The captives taken from the British Isles were joined by countless Slavs from eastern villages, forming the great river of humanity that flowed southward into empires hungry for labor. What made these markets thrive was not only demand, but organization. The Vikings had built a lattice of trade where silver from Baghdad could pay for timber in Norway, where silk from Constantinople might pass through Birka before reaching a chieftain's hall. And at the center of this lattice, human beings were exchanged as routinely as cloth or cattle. Imagine the scene: a row of women, barefoot and weary, their wrists rubbed raw from rope. Traders inspect them openly, lifting chins, checking teeth, weighing strength. Around them swirl buyers, farmers in need of laborers, warriors seeking concubines, merchants with an eye to resell farther afield. In such places, whatever fragments of dignity the captives still clung to were stripped away. The markets did not whisper. They shouted. They were public, accepted, and profitable. In Dublin, Hedeby, Birka, and beyond, they stood as proof that slavery was not a marginal practice of Viking society. It was one of its beating hearts. If Dublin was the western hub of this grim economy, the East offered something even larger, a gateway into the vast river routes of Eastern Europe. From the Baltic Sea, Viking ships slipped into rivers like the Daugava, the Dnieper, and the Volga, carving watery highways through the dense forests and endless plains of the Slavic lands. Here the Vikings were not only raiders, but settlers and traders, known in Arabic and Byzantine sources as the Rus. They established fortified towns along the rivers, places like Novgorod and Kiev, where markets thrived on furs, wax, honey, and above all, human beings. The Slavs themselves became the largest pool of captives, so numerous that in many medieval languages their name, Slav, became synonymous with slave. Arab writers give us some of the clearest windows into this trade. The Persian geographer Ibn Rusta, writing in the early 10th century, described the Rus without hesitation. They attack the Sakaliba, seize them, and sell them at Khazar and Bulgar. The words are blunt, matter of fact, as if he were describing the harvest of grain. To him, this was not aberration but regular commerce, the predictable traffic of human lives. From the markets of the Khazars and Volga Bulgars, captives were funneled farther south. Some reached Constantinople, the glittering Byzantine capital, where the emperor's court needed slaves for its palaces, workshops, and galleys. Others continued to Baghdad, the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, where silver coins, dirhams, flowed north in staggering numbers. These coins, cut and bent to mark transactions, would end up buried in hoards across Scandinavia, silent witnesses to the traffic that had brought them there. The scale is difficult to fathom. A girl taken from an English hamlet might first be marched to Dublin, exchanged to another trader, ferried across the Baltic to Birka, then forced down the Dnieper or Volga on a grueling trek. By the time she reached Constantinople or Baghdad, she may have been sold and resold several times, each transaction treating her body as nothing more than capital. For the Norse, this eastward expansion was a triumph of navigation and ruthlessness. They had tied their world to the great empires of the south. But for the captives, it was a journey through layers of despair, each market stripping away another shred of hope. The eastern routes reveal the global scale of the Viking slave trade. This was not a backwater economy, not a regional cruelty confined to northern seas. It was a system that connected the villages of Ireland and the forests of the Slavs to the palaces of Constantinople and the mosques of Baghdad, a web of rivers and seas bound together by violence, profit, and the relentless demand for human lives. The sagas speak in riddles, the chronicles in brevity, but the soil of Scandinavia tells its own truth. Across Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, thousands of silver coins have been unearthed. Islamic dirhams minted in places like Samarkand, Baghdad, and Nishapur. They bear Kufic script, the flowing calligraphy of the Abbasid world, and they lie not in single pieces but in hoards, hundreds, sometimes thousands, buried in fields, tucked into graves, hidden beneath hearths. On the island of Gotland alone, more than 80 war such coins have been found. They are bent and cut into fragments, used as hack silver, a flexible currency in a society that valued weight more than stamp. Each coin, each clipped shard, is a receipt of exchange, proof that the northern traders were deeply tied into a global economy. And behind that flow of silver lay the human traffic that made it possible. No written ledger records the number of captives sold, but the weight of these hoards whispers of scale. This was not the occasional ransom of a noble or the sporadic sale of a village captive. This was trade measured in tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, sustained over centuries. Archaeology provides more than coins. In ship burials, skeletal remains tell of lives worn down by endless toil, backs bent, joints ground, teeth cracked from grinding grain. At Flakstad in Norway, a woman's grave held not only ornaments, but the bones of others laid around her, one of them decapitated. Scholars suspect these were slaves. Buried as her attendants even in death, in the Grand Osberg ship burial, 2 women were found, one richly adorned, clearly highborn, the other younger, her body bearing signs of strain. Many believe she was a thrall, sacrificed to accompany her mistress into the afterlife. These discoveries force us to reckon with the everyday scale of bondage. The dirham hoards show the trade's reach. The bones show its cost. Together, they form a silent ledger more damning than any saga. For the Norse, silver was more than wealth. It was status, power, the means to reward followers and fund expeditions. A chieftain's hall gleamed with it, his reputation measured by the weight of coins he could scatter across a feast. But to hold those coins was also to hold the lives of the captives who had been sold to acquire them. Every hoard, every clipped dirham, every bent fragment of silver is a reminder. The prosperity of the Viking Age was not born only of courage and sails. It was paid for in bodies. Arrival at the market was not the end of humiliation. It was its cruelest peak. Whatever dignity a captive still clung to was stripped away in the open air, under the gaze of strangers. The Arab envoy Ahmad ibn Fadlan, traveling along the Volga in the year 922, left us one of the starkest accounts. He described Norse merchants setting up bazaars beside the river, arranging their captives in rows as if they were objects for display. Buyers wandered among them, inspecting their bodies with the same indifference they might show a bolt of cloth or a sturdy ox. Teeth were checked, limbs tested for strength, hair pulled to judge health. What Ibn Fadlan noted with particular disgust was how brazenly sexual exploitation was folded into the sales process. A trader, he wrote, might publicly lie with a slave girl while his companions watched, not out of desire, but to prove her value before the sale. No curtains, no concealment, just the brutal performance of dominion, staged for profit. To the Norse merchants, this was demonstration. To the captives, it was the final proof that their bodies no longer belonged to them. For women, especially, the market was a place of unbearable exposure. The transition from person to property became complete when their worth was reduced to physical endurance or sexual availability. A daughter of Ireland or a nun from Northumbria might have once walked with respect, but here she was cattle, her fate determined by the weight of a buyer's purse. These markets were not hidden away in shameful corners. They were public spaces, loud, mercantile, alive with bargaining. Merchants haggled over prices. Farmers considered how many laborers they needed. Warriors weighed whether to buy a concubine. All around, the captives stood in silence, knowing that each glance measured not who they were, but what they were worth. For those sold, the transaction was swift, a clink of silver, a nod of agreement, and one life passed from one master to another. For those unsold, the ordeal stretched longer, waiting in uncertainty, hoping for an outcome less cruel, knowing hope itself was a dangerous indulgence. To walk through such a market was to feel how thoroughly the Norse had normalized the trade in human beings. Here, in plain daylight, the machinery of slavery revealed itself not as an aberration, but as ordinary commerce, and for the women trapped within it, there was no escape, only the certainty that their lives had been reduced to merchandise. For those who survived the raid, the voyage, and the market, life as a thrall began in earnest, and it was a life of endless labor, from dawn until long after dark. The enslaved woman's existence was consumed by the heaviest and most degrading tasks, work that free-born women would never be asked to shoulder. The day might begin at the quernstone, grinding grain hour after hour until the muscles in her arms trembled and her teeth wore down from grit in the flour. Then came the buckets, heavy with icy water drawn from streams or wells, carried across uneven ground to the longhouse. Firewood had to be gathered, the hearth kept alive, meals prepared for an entire household. Laundry was no small chore. Heavy wool garments scrubbed in cold rivers, wrung and beaten, leaving fingers raw. Brewing ale required more strength and patience still. Hauling grain, stirring vats, wading through the fermenting process. Textile work added yet another burden. The Norse economy ran on wool, and thralls provided the hands that kept it flowing. Shearing sheep, washing fleece, carding fibers, spinning thread, weaving on massive looms, All of it fell to enslaved women. The Rigstula, that strange old Norse poem tracing the birth of social classes, gives us a poetic but accurate image. It describes thralls as dark-skinned from sun and labor, with knotted fingers, crooked backs, and scarred bodies. Far from exaggeration, this picture matches what archaeology tells us. Skeletons of the Viking Age show signs of malnutrition and strain, spinal deformities from heavy lifting, worn-down joints from ceaseless grinding, evidence of diets meager compared to those of freeborn people. And the work never truly ended. While free women might weave or manage households, enslaved women endured the constant suspicion of mistresses, the casual blows of masters, the knowledge that any mistake could bring punishment. They slept at the edge of longhouses, in corners close to animals or stored goods, their place in the social order marked by proximity to things rather than people. The toll was not just physical but spiritual. To be treated as livestock, to be valued less than cattle, was to live each day under a reminder that you were no longer seen as fully human. Some captives may have clung to memory of a father's blessing, a mother's voice, the green fields of home, but memory itself could become a torment, a contrast to the unending present of servitude. This was the hidden backbone of Viking society. The longhouses stood warm in winter because thralls fetched the firewood. The ships sailed on woven sails because thralls spun and wove the wool. The feasts were plentiful because thralls had ground the grain and brewed the ale. Their labor was the silent force that allowed chieftains to boast of wealth, warriors to sail on conquest, poets to sing of glory. In the sagas, thralls are rarely given names. They appear only as shadows, an unnamed servant, a background figure. Yet without them, the world those sagas celebrate could not have existed. Their silence, enforced in life, echoes still in the sources, but their bones, their labor, and the few scraps of verse that describe them tell us the truth. The Viking Age was built on their backs. For many enslaved women, the burden of labor was only one half of their ordeal. The other was far darker, for their bodies were not their own. Under Norse law, a thrall had no protection against sexual use to their masters. The law did not call it an offense, it called it a right. Within longhouses across Scandinavia and the colonies, enslaved women were taken as concubines. The Old Norse word was frilla, and sagas written centuries later describe these arrangements openly, without shame or hesitation. To powerful men, it was a matter of course. To the women, it was a sentence without appeal. One of the most haunting tales comes from Laxdæla saga, which tells of Melkorka, an Irish princess captured in a raid. Legend says her tongue was cut out, silencing her forever. Bought by a wealthy chieftain in Norway and brought to Iceland, she lived as his concubine, bearing him a son, Olaf the Peacock, who would rise to prominence in the saga. Despite her noble birth, Melkorka's status never rose above that of a thrall. She is remembered not for the life she lost, but for the bloodline she carried forward against her will. These unions were not private shames, they were woven into household life. A lawful wife might sit across the fire from her husband's concubine, forced to share her home with the woman who bore his illegitimate children. Such children, called friluburn, occupied an uneasy place in society. Sometimes their fathers freed them and acknowledged them, granting them partial inheritance. Other times, they were denied, condemned to remain in bondage like their mothers. The sagas speak of these dynamics with the same casualness they apply to farming or feuding. What they rarely acknowledge is the atmosphere it created within the walls of the longhouse, a place where wives endured humiliation, concubines endured domination, and children grew up divided by invisible but unbreakable lines. For the enslaved woman herself, the reality was stark. She could be summoned at will, treated as a concubine one night and a laborer the next. Her humanity was denied at every turn, reduced to utility, her hands for work, her womb for heirs, her silence for convenience. To resist was unthinkable. To endure was her only option. And yet, though their voices were not recorded, the legacy of these women lingers. Modern DNA studies in Iceland reveal that while most of the male ancestry traces back to Scandinavia, more than 60% of maternal ancestry stems from the British Isles, especially Ireland and Scotland. These numbers speak louder than sagas. They testify to the countless women carried across the sea against their will, who became the mothers of a new nation. Every hearth that burned in Iceland, every farmstead that grew from barren soil, owed something to those women. Women who crossed the sea not as wives or settlers, but as captives. Their suffering is etched into bloodlines still alive today. Centuries after the Viking Age faded into legend, The story of its captives lingers not only in chronicles or sagas, but in blood. Modern genetic studies, particularly in Iceland, have revealed a startling pattern that speaks to the unspoken truths of Norse expansion. When researchers examined the Y chromosomes, the paternal lines of today's Icelandic population, the results were overwhelmingly Scandinavian. Nearly 4 out of 5 traced back to Norse male settlers. Yet when they turned to mitochondrial DNA, which passes only from mothers to children, the picture shifted dramatically. More than 60% of maternal ancestry was Gaelic, rooted in Ireland and Scotland. The numbers are undeniable. Iceland was not settled by Scandinavian families arriving hand in hand to build a new society. It was settled by Norse men, and by women they had taken from the British Isles, often against their will. Those women, captured in raids, marched to ships in ropes, sold in Dublin's markets, became the mothers of a new nation. This is history written in bone and blood, carried silently for 1,000 years. It cannot be softened by saga poetry or blurred by romantic images of explorers. Each genetic marker is a trace of a journey that began in terror. The night raid, the burning village, the chains that cut into flesh. The legacy is not confined to Iceland. Across the North Atlantic world, from Orkney to the Faroes, from Greenland to coastal Norway, traces of Gaelic maternal ancestry persist. The Norse diaspora was carried on the backs of enslaved women. Their bloodlines fed into Viking colonies, shaping populations for centuries to come. In some sagas, these women flicker briefly at the margins. A concubine mentioned only as the mother of a hero, an unnamed thrall who bore a man's child. The scribes who wrote these stories rarely considered them worth remembering, but modern science has restored their presence, revealing just how essential they were to the Viking world. The statistics force us to confront a grim reality. What sagas celebrated as bold settlement was often built on abduction. Behind every longhouse in Iceland, every farm carved out of volcanic soil, there is an untold story of a woman who crossed the sea in chains. She may never have spoken her native tongue again. She may have died nameless in a land not her own. Yet her descendants walk the earth today, living proof of her endurance. This is perhaps the most haunting legacy of the Viking Age, that its violence echoes not only in ruins and chronicles, but in living memory carried within our very cells. For some captives, fate twisted in different directions. A woman of noble birth, princess, abbess, daughter of a king, could sometimes be worth more alive than dead. Such women were held not as household slaves, but as bargaining chips. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Irish annals describe Viking leaders demanding vast ransoms, silver, land, or political concessions in exchange for a single high-born captive. Yet ransom was not mercy. It was a transaction. Every moment of captivity lived under the threat of violence. But for others, there was a fate more harrowing than ransom or bondage. Ritual sacrifice. Here, the brutality of slavery intertwined with religion and spectacle, turning captives into offerings. The most detailed and chilling description comes again from Ahmad ibn Fadlan. In 922, along the Volga River, he witnessed the funeral of a powerful Rus chieftain. Part of the ceremony demanded that one of the man's enslaved women volunteer to die with him, destined to serve her master in the next world. Volunteer, however, was a fiction. A thrall could not refuse. For 10 days, the chosen girl was dressed in fine clothes, plied with intoxicating drinks, paraded from tent to tent. Ibn Fadlan records with horror that the chieftain's retainers took turns forcing themselves upon her, telling her to relay each act to her dead master as proof of their loyalty. It was not ritual. It was violation masked as devotion. On the final day, she was led to the ship where her master's body lay. An old woman known as the Angel of Death guided her steps. Before the gathered crowd, the girl was placed beside the corpse. A cord was looped around her neck. As 2 men pulled it tight, the Angel of Death drove a blade into her ribs again and again. Her screams were drowned out by warriors pounding their shields, not in mourning but to mask the sound, so that other thralls would not fear when their turn came. The ship was set aflame, carrying lord and slave together into smoke and legend. Archaeology suggests Ibn Fadlan's account was not an isolated spectacle. In Norway, the Oseberg ship burial revealed 2 women, one older, richly adorned, the other younger, her skeleton showing signs of hardship. Many scholars believe she was a thrall, sacrificed to accompany her mistress. At Flagstad, another grave contained a decapitated individual buried beside a high-ranking woman. Again and again, bones whisper the same story, that even in death, captives were treated as possessions, forced to serve masters beyond the grave. This ritual cruelty reminds us that for enslaved women, There was no boundary safe from violation, not labor, not the body, not even death itself. They could be ransomed, sold, worked to exhaustion, taken as concubines, or slaughtered as tokens of honor. Their fates were not written in their own hands, but in the whims of men who saw them as nothing more than wealth to be spent. In the sagas, such deaths are rarely dwelt upon. They are mentioned in passing, like curiosities, but for the women who endured them, they were the final, unbearable proof of a society that viewed them as objects. To be killed as a sacrifice was not just to lose life, it was to be denied even the dignity of dying for oneself. To understand the Viking Age fully, we must strip away the glamour and face its foundations. Slavery was not a byproduct of Norse expansion. It was its engine. The wealth of chieftains, the power of kings. The very sails that carried longships across oceans were paid for by the toil, suffering, and silence of thralls. A man's prestige was measured in part by how many enslaved people labored in his household. Sagas describe heroes and farmers alike boasting not only of silver or fine land, but of the human lives they commanded. Even poetry, when it mentions thralls, does so casually, without outrage, proof that this system was not questioned but assumed. Slavery was stitched into the very fabric of society, its cruelty so familiar that it passed without notice. Occasionally, there were exceptions. A master might grant freedom to a loyal thrall, rewarding years of service or making provisions in a will. The Hating runestone in Denmark, for example, records how Tolki the blacksmith honored his former master who gave him liberty and gold. Yet stories like this survive because they were rare. For most, bondage lasted not only a lifetime but carried on through their children, ensuring that slavery reproduced itself across generations. The slow unraveling came not from moral awakening but from shifting faith and politics. As Christianity spread across Scandinavia in the 10th and 11th centuries, church leaders condemned the enslavement of fellow Christians. This did not end slavery, but it redirected it. Pagan Slavs and Baltic peoples became the new preferred captives, while laws were gradually reshaped to discourage the sale of baptized men and women. Over time, the stark slavery of the Viking Age softened into the equally coercive bonds of medieval serfdom, where freedom was still elusive, but chains were less visible. Yet for centuries before that transition, the trade flourished unchecked. The silver hordes of Gotland, the sagas of warrior kings, the voyages to Iceland, Greenland, and even Vinland, all drew strength from the backs of captives. The plundered labor of women fed the longhouses. Their stolen bodies expanded bloodlines. Their silenced voices echo through the margins of every Viking triumph. To tell the Viking Age only as a saga of exploration and conquest is to tell half a story. The other half lies in the unmarked graves, in the terse lines of the annals, in the genetic traces carried in living people. It lies in the countless unnamed women who ground the grain, spun the wool, bore children into bondage, and sometimes were offered up in fire to honor masters who had stolen their lives. Their names are lost, their stories are fragmented, but without them, there is no Viking Age. The dragon-proud ships, the daring raids, the distant colonies, all were built on their suffering. The true legacy of the North is not only carved in runestones or sung in sagas, but etched in the silence of the thralls who held up the world and received no songs in return. The Viking Age is remembered for its freedom-loving warriors, yet that freedom rested entirely on the unfree. To admire one without acknowledging the other is to look away from the truth. Behind the romance of longships lies a darker sea, the hidden history of women captured, broken, and forgotten. And to honor history honestly, we must remember them too. Thank you for watching and sharing this journey into one of the darkest and most revealing chapters of our past. History is not only about glory and conquest, it is also about the forgotten voices, the silenced lives, and the lessons we must carry forward. If you found value in this story, consider subscribing and joining our community, where we explore historical drama, philosophy, and the truths that still echo in our world today. Your support allows us to bring more untold stories to light.